I thought about going to school to learn photography, but instead I bought expensive camera gear that I wasn't sure how to use, so I decided to learn photography from the experts on YouTube.
You can learn a lot about photography not only from my website, but from many other places online that would be far less expensive than going to college.
I have to admit that the reason I bought my first professional mirrorless camera wasn't to do photography. It was actually to make YouTube videos with a blurry background. But when I bought the Lumix G95, I quickly realized I enjoyed taking photos just as much as making videos. But the only problem was I was stuck in intelligent auto mode. I knew nothing about my settings, and I wasn't able to get the same blurry background as the people on YouTube. When I sat down to watch some how-to videos, I quickly realized that I should be in manual mode. When I came across Simone d'Entremont's channel, he explained just how freeing using manual mode could be.
And shooting in manual gives you the ultimate control of the camera, not allowing the camera to make the creative decisions, but putting those in your hands so you can take more creative photos.
I soon realized that if I wanted to shoot in manual mode, I had to learn something called the exposure triangle. So I watched some how-to videos from Tony and Chelsea Northrup.
So remember, a low aperture number means low background sharpness. So I'm going to put my camera on f11. And you can see a lot of the background is still in focus. But if I turn it all the way down to f18, you get that nice smooth background blur.
I found myself a little overwhelmed at trying to learn all three of the elements of the exposure triangle all at once, and as soon as I learned about aperture being the way to get a blurry background, I decided I'd stop there and take my camera out and try to open my aperture as wide as I could get it. Unfortunately, the aperture on my Lumix kit lens only opened up to f3.5, but I figured that should be good enough to blur out the background. Since I hadn't learned much about shutter speed yet, I figured it was similar to aperture. The lower the number, the better. So I was using about 1/25. After coming home disappointed with some majorly overexposed photos, I realized that maybe I better move on and learn about shutter speed too.
A fast shutter speed, like 1/2000th of a second, could freeze something very fast, like a flying bird. A slower shutter speed, like 1/125th of a second, would be adequate for like a portrait or a still life. If you wanted to go even slower and show that motion in a waterfall, you could go to a couple of seconds. And if you slow it down even more, like 30 seconds or longer, you can see beautiful stars in a night sky. If you know how to control your shutter speed, you can take beautiful photos in all different situations.
It's strange that after watching the video, I thought I had all the concepts down pat. But when I took my camera out into the real world to practice, I couldn't remember which shutter speed to use for which scenario. I did notice that the more I increased my shutter speed, the overexposure became better, but I was still disappointed with blurry photos when I got home. I had heard the Lumix G95 had amazing autofocus, so I knew it couldn't be the camera. I needed to watch some more videos. I came across this one video by Mark Smith which explained about the reciprocal rule.
The shutter speed focal length rule is a way of ensuring you get sharp photos when shooting handheld. As long as your subject is in focus and you get a good exposure, you know that you'll get many more usable photos when using this technique. All you do is match your focal length number to your shutter speed number. And whatever that shutter speed is, you don't use any slower shutter speeds when shooting handheld. If I was taking a photograph with a 50mm lens, I'd make sure the slowest shutter speed I used was 1/50th of a second. So I could shoot a photograph with 1/50th of a second right through to 1/8000th of a second or faster if I have a faster shutter mechanism in the camera that I'm using, but not any slower.
I decided that since I was using the Lumix 12 to 60mm lens, and I was shooting mostly at 60mm, my shutter speed should be 1/60th. But for some reason, I still came home disappointed with blurry photos. Since I'm not one to give up, I kept practicing and cranking up my shutter speed, and eventually I came home with some crisp photos. I figured the higher the shutter speed, the better, so eventually I worked my way up to 1/2000th. Around the time I thought it was a good idea to crank my shutter speed, I knew very little about ISO. The only thing I had learned is that you should keep it as low as possible to avoid noise in your photos. You wanted to avoid noise at any cost. So one day when I was taking some photos in the dark woods, I had my ISO at 100 and my shutter speed at 1/2000th, and when I got home I noticed my photos were really underexposed, and when I tried to bring up the exposure in Lightroom, I was confronted with noise for the first time. I'd probably had a little noise in other photos, but this time it was unmistakable. That's when I decided I needed to sit down and watch a dedicated video about ISO. And that's when Tony Northrup explained that high ISO isn't what causes noise. It's a lack of light. He explained that ISO is more of a speedometer.
High ISOs don't cause high noise, but short shutter speeds, high f-stop numbers, and low light all cause high noise. What do those three things have in common? Well, they're all reducing the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor. What if this whole time it was actually about light and we'd been blaming this perfectly harmless ISO? Knowing this can give you a really useful tool. Instead of thinking about ISO as something that causes noise, think of it like a speedometer. You don't blame the speedometer when you get pulled over for speeding, right? No, it's the accelerator that causes your car to go fast. The speedometer just tells you how fast you're going.
Right around the time I almost wanted to give up on using manual mode because it felt too difficult, I discovered a setting called Auto ISO, and that changed everything. I started to realize I could back off the shutter speed a little bit. I didn't need to use 1/2000th for landscapes. I also learned that if I backed off the caffeine and kept my hands a little more steady, I could get away with 1/100th easily. My exposure was getting better and I was getting less blur in my shots. I was getting less noise except when I was shooting in low light, and that's around the time I realized that Micro Four Thirds sensors did have some limitations when it came to low light, and a little noise was to be expected. But this was before gas set in, and I was still relatively happy using my Lumix G95 and the kit lens. One day when I was at the nature park, I accidentally had my shutter speed set really low, and I accidentally jerked my camera, but when I got home, instead of being upset by the effect of the blur, I was actually enchanted by it. And that's when I discovered this video by Jared Polin that explained that sometimes you don't always want to freeze a motion. Sometimes you actually want to show motion in your photographs.
In this video, I want to show you that you can do more than just freeze action with shutter speed. We all know when you start out, it's really easy to capture motion. But that starts to get old and it gets boring after a while because all you're doing is freezing motion. You're not conveying motion. So what are the other things that you can do to convey motion that just doesn't revolve around giving you the highest shutter speed in the world to just freeze action? Because action is great to freeze, but it's also great when you convey the motion that exists in the action that you are trying to capture. There are things like slowing the shutter speed down and getting the motion that way. There's long exposures, panning, which is slowing a shutter speed down and moving with your subject as they go across the screen, or even using flash to convey motion.
I had somehow had it set in my mind that if there was any blur in my photos at all, it was wrong. Jared Polin really opened my eyes that I could have a little motion blur and it wouldn't be the end of the world. I started to wonder what other concepts in photography I had wrong. Could it be possible that having a blurry background was not the most important thing? And that's when I came across the Brian James Photography channel. And that's when I realized maybe you don't always need the most shallow depth of field in your photography.
Now, I've seen people where they've been shooting faces at f1.4, f1.8, f2, and really trying to get it down there, especially on things like full frame cameras where the depth of field is comparatively shorter still. And they have a wonderful photograph where the eye is beautifully in focus, but the nose and the ears are so far out of focus because the depth of field is less than that distance. So by the time you get the eyes in focus, the tip of the nose and the ears are out. What's the point of that? Very, very often you'll see a photograph which is like that, which technically it's wonderful because you've got that wonderful shallow depth of field bokeh, but it's missed the point of the portrait.
This wouldn't be the first time that I'd learn a concept from one expert on YouTube just to have it challenged by another expert. As far as composition goes, I thought you were supposed to use the rule of thirds. I thought it was illegal to have your subject right in the center.
is a very common composition. Again, she's just right smack in the middle of the frame. Applying a little rule of thirds will make this snapshot much more interesting. See, I just moved the camera like that. I just moved the camera to the right a little bit, and it got much better already. You can see that this image uses the rule of thirds in several different ways. She is positioned along the vertical third, the fence that she's leaning against is along the lower third, and the horizon is positioned along the right third. So it's a good example. And though it's a simple picture and not a stunning picture, it still is much improved by relying on the rule of thirds.
But then I was watching the Pangolin Wildlife Photography channel, and Sabine explained that sometimes symmetry is extremely pleasing to the human eye.
The first and most obvious alternative to the rule of thirds is placing your horizon or subject right in the center of the frame. A prominent horizontal line in the dead center of an image perfectly bisects it and gives equal weight to the two halves of the image. Shooting a subject centrally works particularly well when using a portrait or square format, where there often simply isn't a horizontal space to allow the subject to be placed off to the left or right of center. An animal or bird from the front that is looking straight down the lens lends itself to be framed in the center, rather than using the rule of thirds. This way the viewer is directly drawn towards the subject, reducing the importance of the setting or backdrop and creating an impactful portrait. You might also place your subject dead center, cropping in tightly to avoid any distractions. Here you might partially adhere to the rule of thirds by placing both eyes on the intersecting lines, even though the subject itself is centered. So you are both obeying and breaking the rules of thirds at the same time. In case of symmetry and reflections, photographs tend to look again more pleasing and balanced if the subject is in the center. As much as we like to look at movement, we are also attracted to symmetry, which gives us a feeling of peace and serenity.
I was content shooting in JPEG format on my camera until I watched a video from Jared Polin. He explained that if you shoot in RAW, the camera would capture so much more detail, and you had so much more flexibility when you were editing in Lightroom.
It's common sense to me, but you can see right here the differences between the two. The RAW is so much better. When we go up into the sky, just look at what it looks like in the sky here. The detail isn't the same. It's much smoother and easier and more even on the RAW file. They are edited the exact same way. I used the same settings from one to the other to get this edit.
But then Tony Northrup explained that JPEGs aren't really quite so bad.
RAW is capable of more extreme editing, but if you need to just go in and do some basic stuff, then you can definitely edit a JPEG and retain the image quality.
Yeah, so if you had your camera set to JPEG, it's not like your pictures are lost. You can do no editing. You can fix the white balance. You can clone things out. You can adjust the contrast. You can even actually recover shadows and highlights quite a bit.
Yeah.
Not as much as RAW files, but you can still do a lot.
Even though the photography experts on YouTube may not agree on every point, they're an invaluable resource of free photography education. And I don't feel so bad about not going to college to learn it. If you like this video, give it a like. Consider subscribing for more photography-related content from a newbie like me. God bless.